Hello, welcome to Schrödinger's Chat, the podcast where I explore the real science behind the biggest questions in the universe, as well as some of the quirkier science we encounter every day. I'm Anna, a physics student with a lot of curiosity and a passion for understanding how the world works. From the smallest particles to the largest galaxies, join me as we uncover the mysteries and wonders of the universe and explore how physics shapes the world around us. Hello, welcome back. Before we start, another apology that it's been such a long time since the last episode. I think it was February that I did the last episode. I have been extremely busy revising for and sitting my A-level exams, which have taken about 6 weeks in total. For any non-UK listeners out there, these are the big academic exams that are taken at the end of 2 years of intense study of, in my case, 4 subjects, and mark the end of my secondary school career. The results of these exams will determine whether I get into university. It has genuinely been one of the busiest times of my life in terms of pressure and academic work, and I'm so glad they're finished now. In fact, if you have extremely perceptive hearing, you may have noticed that in the intro, I no longer say, "I'm Anna, a sixth form physics student." I have to drop the sixth form from now on and just be a physics student, so I did actually have to re-record the intro today after the last few episodes since the start. I was able to just sort of paste in the same intro from every episode. I'm very much looking forward to getting back into science for the sake of curiosity and researching the things that interest me after months of science being in the language of mark schemes and past papers. For the next 2 and a bit months, I get to enjoy the long-awaited A-level summer. With no schoolwork or university applications, I look forward to focusing more on the podcast and getting many more episodes out than I have been able to in the past 6 months. Anyway, for today's episode, I decided to do something fairly gentle for the first episode back after A-levels. To be honest, I wanted to do something slightly less intense whilst I get back into the swing of researching, writing and recording the podcast. Before we start, a quick reminder to leave a review or a comment if you like this podcast, and check out the podcast Instagram page, Schrödinger's Chat Podcast on Instagram. Here I post all sorts from extra bits relating to the episodes, STEM book recommendations, and various other nerdy science stuff. Also, I have recently uploaded the podcast to YouTube, so if you prefer to listen that way, you can go and subscribe to that too. It's the same name, Schrödinger's Chat Podcast. So yeah, check that out if that's your thing. Let's finally get on with the episode. I wonder what comes to your mind when I mention something that emits light. Perhaps a light bulb, flames, or the sun. Maybe phone screens, the moon, or light reflecting off a shiny surface. Even within all of these bright things, we have to be careful in how we classify them. There are things that produce their own light, which we call light sources, and things that are actually just good at reflecting light. For example, stars produce their own light. The daylight on Earth is directly from the sun's light. Meanwhile, the moon does not produce its own light. There's no fire or burning reaction happening on the moon, but it reflects the sun's light, causing it to shine so we can see it. In fact, I think we often mainly associate light with fire or astronomical objects like stars, or man-made electrical things like light bulbs. However, there is another category of light-emitting things that is more obscure but amazing. I'm talking about bioluminescence. I think this episode also follows on quite nicely then from episode 11, The Dark Side of Light, where we looked at all the negative effects of light pollution on the natural world. So this episode, let's look at the light that does belong, nature's extraordinary way of producing its own light. First, let's consider the sorts of living things that do produce light in this way, as it is much rarer to see bioluminescing things in your day-to-day life than other light producers. The place on Earth where you find the most bioluminescence is the ocean. When you think about it, that makes sense, as the ocean is one of the places where there is often very little sunlight, if at all, if you go deep enough. So it seems natural that you would find a lot of bioluminescing organisms somewhere where there is no other light source. I'm going to start this journey through glowing waters at the ocean's surface with bioluminescent plankton, which I think is actually quite a well-known phenomena. I think it sort of goes periodically viral on social media for its particularly magical appearance, as it makes the ocean look like it's glittering and sparkling. There are even tourist destinations specifically advertised for this, where there are bioluminescent bays, as they're called, where there is a particularly large quantity of these plankton. Now, there are a few types of bioluminescing plankton, but the most common variety is the dinoflagellates, unicellular organisms sometimes called fire plants due to the name of the division of algae that they belong to, called pyrophyta. When water containing the plankton is disturbed, a neon bluey green colour of light is emitted. This is due to a chemical reaction. Inside the dinoflagellate cell, there are structures called scintillans. The scintillans contain an organic compound called luciferin and the enzyme luciferase. When the water surrounding the dinoflagellate is disturbed, the physical stress on the cell's outer membrane causes an electrical impulse, which in turn decreases the pH in the cell. The change in pH activates the luciferase enzyme, which acts as a catalyst for the reaction between luciferin and oxygen. A catalyst speeds up the rate of a reaction without being used up itself, so luciferase makes this reaction occur faster, but is not itself reacting. When this reaction occurs, the chemical energy released is converted almost entirely efficiently into radiant light, blue-green in colour. There is very little heat loss to the environment in this reaction, so the light produced is often referred to as cold light. The energy is released as a quick, short flash of light. Since there must be physical stress on the cell for this reaction to occur, the bioluminescence only occurs when the water is disturbed, so it appears as short, glittering sparkles of light. However, whilst this glowing effect looks pretty, it's actually a defense mechanism of the plankton. And the dinoflagellates actually have what I think is a very interesting, slightly counterintuitive defense mechanism. Their bioluminescence has two functions as a defense mechanism. One is to startle predators trying to eat them, and the other is to attract predators. Now, hang on, because I know that sounds ridiculous. You're probably thinking, but Anna, you literally just said they want to startle the predators. Why would they also want to attract them? The reason is that the glowing draws attention to the attacking predator that eats the plankton, which in turn may attract a larger predator that eats the attacking predator. This is also meant to confuse the plankton-eating predator into worrying about its own predators, even if there isn't another predator after it. I think this is really fascinating because it's a quite complex, almost strategic mechanism that I don't think I've really seen anything like, even in much larger animals. And the fact that this exists in just a unicellular organism is really quite astonishing. Another cool thing about the dinoflagellates is that they can be found in a variety of different water environments. 90% are found in marine environments, but 10% exist in freshwater environments, including lakes, rivers, and even bogs. In the oceans and seas, they exist in a range of conditions. They are commonly found in tropical and cooler waters, and some even live inside host organisms such as corals, jellyfish, and clams. They can be found all around the world, with particular hotspots being Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and the Maldives, but bioluminescence due to dinoflagellates has even been recorded here in the UK, in Wales and Cornwall, particularly when the waters are warmer in the summertime. Next, let's literally dive a little deeper and descend further into the ocean to the twilight zone, where we meet our second bioluminescent creature, the aptly named lanternfish. Just to give you a sense of how dark it is at this point, the twilight zone is between 200 to 1,000 metres below the ocean's surface, and here it's dysphotic. It is just beyond the depth where photosynthesis is possible, receiving only about 1% of the sunlight at the surface at its shallowest point, and fading out to complete darkness at its deepest parts. The lanternfish appears to have tons of greenish-blue lights all over its body, arranged in a unique pattern, and light appears to run along these rows in flashing patterns. There are more than 245 species of lanternfish, and each one has a specific pattern of these flashing lights. The light is produced by specialised organs called photophores, which are amazingly high-tech. The photophores have multiple layers with different functions that combine to create the astonishing flashing effect. The blue-green light itself comes from light-producing cells called photocytes. Inside the photocytes, the same luciferase-catalyzed chemical reaction takes place between oxygen and luciferin that I explained earlier for the dinoflagellates. This explains the blue-green light produced, but how does it maintain this glowing effect and flash? I mean, the same reaction takes place in dinoflagellates, but they aren't able to maintain the glow for a long period of time, unless the cell is constantly physically disturbed. So how do lanternfish independently keep their bioluminescence switched on, if you like? The difference here is that instead of requiring physical stress for a quick flash of light, since the lanternfish is a multicellular organism, it can regulate the reaction with its blood flow and nervous system, so it can give a more constant glowing effect compared to the short dinoflagellate bursts. The chemical reaction depends on the availability of the reactants. The lanternfish's brain and nervous system can regulate oxygen and luciferin supply, controlling the reaction, and therefore controlling the intensity and presence of the light. This regulation is like their light switch for their bioluminescence, and it's how they in effect switch their bioluminescence on and off to create flashing patterns. But it's not all down to the reaction in the photophores. The photophores are covered by specially modified scales, made of cells with thicker, transparent windows in the centre, which act as a lens, dispersing the light uniformly. Then beneath and around the photocytes, crystals form a cup shape that acts like a parabolic reflector. Parabolic is the shape, a quadratic curve which looks like a U-shaped curve, and a reflector can be thought of as a mirror. The lens and reflector work together to intensify, scatter, and direct the light in certain directions. So the photocyte is basically surrounded by a U-shaped mirror. The lens and reflector work together to intensify, scatter, and direct the light in certain directions. Again, I am left really quite astonished how advanced this whole mechanism is. The specialised cells perform the same function as man-made components we have in telescopes and cameras, which is just amazing. I'll never stop being in awe of just how complex and specific nature can be. Now, the function of the lanternfish's bioluminescence is multifaceted and different to that of the plankton. One function is a type of camouflage called counter-illumination. To understand how this works, we need a quick insight into the perspective of an ocean predator and how it hunts. Imagine you're a predator lurking in the depths, and you are looking upwards towards the surface for your prey. Your eyesight is probably not very good. You can't see clear shapes necessarily, or a whole spectrum of colours that us humans can see, but you can detect shadows and changes in the light intensity. So, if you see a dark silhouette moving above you, you register a disruption in the usual faint intensity of light from the surface, indicating to you that your food has arrived. This is often actually why sharks attack surfers. From below, the dark oval outline of their surfboard and limbs protruding each side looks just like the shadow of a seal. Now, the lanternfish uses its high-tech glowing property to bypass this issue, in an amazing example of camouflage. The photophores produce light of the same intensity as the faint sunlight from the surface, and the flashing pattern can simulate dappled sunlight through the water. To a predator below, on the lookout for dark silhouettes, this makes the lanternfish virtually invisible. It blends in almost perfectly with the sunlight, hiding their shadows and reducing their chances of being spotted by a predator. Like the plankton I discussed earlier, the lanternfish's bioluminescence can also function to startle predators by dazzling them with confusing flashes of their bright light. There are actually quite a few deep-sea creatures that use their bioluminescence to camouflage and defend in this way. But what makes the lanternfish particularly stand out from other animals is that this is not the only function of their bioluminescence. The fact that their patterns of flashing light are unique to each variety of over 245 species of lanternfish suggests that they also use their bioluminescence for communication. The pattern also varies between male and female lanternfish, so it is thought that they use their unique flashing patterns to send signals and find mates. This method is clearly very effective, as lanternfish are the most abundant of all deep-sea fish varieties, accounting for 60 to 65% of all the biomass of deep-sea fish. Of all the deep-sea bioluminescing species, they are clearly the masters of getting that perfect natural glow. Descending further through the ocean, we meet our last marine bioluminescing creature. So far, we have seen 2 examples of creatures that use bioluminescence primarily for defense. So now let's switch it up and look at the fish that uses it to hunt, the anglerfish. The anglerfish is perhaps one of the most famous bioluminescent animals. It is mainly found 1,000 to 4,000 meters down from the ocean's surface in the midnight zone. Here, the ocean is aphotic. Sunlight has disappeared completely. The darkness is perpetual, the pressure is immense, at 100 to 400 atmospheres, and the temperature never fluctuates much from a chilly 4 degrees Celsius. In this environment, the anglerfish has no hope of spotting prey. In fact, their eyesight is poor, and they rely more on sensing vibration and changes in water pressure to gain information about their surroundings. So instead, the anglerfish lets the prey come to it. Hanging in front of its mouth is a tiny glowing lure, like a fishing rod, giving the fish its name. This is actually a specially evolved dorsal fin spine called an elysium, with a bulb on the end called an esker. By the way, only female anglerfish possess this. Male anglerfish are tiny in comparison, do not have a lure, and their only purpose is to find a female to latch onto and fuse with, at which point they become entirely dependent on the female. So a win for us girls there. Anyway, small animals, curious about the only light they've probably seen in what could be hours in the perpetual darkness of the midnight zone, swim over to investigate. And unfortunately, that's exactly the trap the anglerfish is waiting for them to fall into. The anglerfish waits stationary with her mouth open. Once the prey is busy investigating the lure, which is handily right above the anglerfish's mouth, her jaws snap shut on her victim, which has just become dinner. So, what's the secret to the glowing lure? Well, as you may have noticed by now, it's that same chemical reaction we've seen twice before. In fact, this luciferase-catalyzed chemical reaction between luciferin and oxygen that I keep going on about is the cause of the bioluminescence effect in all organisms that glow in this way. What you may have noticed does change though is how different organisms regulate it. So far, we've seen the dinoflagellates relying on physical disturbance to trigger the reaction, and the lanternfish using their nervous systems and blood flow to regulate the reaction. But anglerfish take a slightly different approach. The anglerfish themselves do not actually possess the ability to run the chemical reaction. They don't have the chemicals inside their bodies. They rely on bacteria inside their lure, commonly the photobacterium. But other strains of bacteria exist in different anglerfish depending on the type of environment created by the differing metabolisms of different hosts. The bioluminescent reaction happens inside the bacteria in exactly the same way I have already discussed, but this raises a question. If the anglerfish itself is not causing or directly in control of the bioluminescence reaction, how does it regulate the light it produces? Well, remember that the reaction requires oxygen, which the anglerfish supplies to the esker via the blood. Like the lanternfish, by restricting the blood flow to the esker, the oxygen supplied to the bacteria can be controlled, and the anglerfish can therefore influence the reaction. Reducing blood flow would slow down the rate of reaction in the bacteria and dim the light. Also, the esker contains cells called melanophores, which are specially adapted to produce and store the dark pigment melanin. These cells can obscure and block out light due to their dark pigment, which is a way for the anglerfish to effectively turn off their lure if they themselves need to hide from predators. This property can also be used to create flashing that, along with their ability to move and wave their lure around, mimics the movement of a small fish, helping to attract prey. They also have some of these melanophores on their body, which helps prevent their skin from reflecting the light from their lure. This helps them to remain almost invisible in the pitch black waters, so as not to alert their prey to their presence, as they quite literally wait for them to take the bait. Now, you might be thinking, what do the bacteria get out of this? They seem to be doing all the hard work producing light, while the anglerfish just sits there barely moving until its food swims right up to its mouth. Surely that's a bit lazy. But the relationship between anglerfish and bacteria is actually symbiotic. As we've already seen, the anglerfish gets an awesome way of hunting without having to use any of its own energy to produce the light vital to its ambush tactics. And the bacteria, they get a nice safe esker to live in, which is rich in nutrients and constantly supplied with oxygen. However, this symbiosis is so peculiar that researchers are still puzzling over exactly how it works. The thing is, anglerfish are not born with a lure or their bacteria, yet they have evolved to have this very unique hunting method that relies on these bacteria to work, meaning their whole life depends on these bacteria. Research suggests that female anglerfish gain their bacteria later in their development when their lure forms by sending out chemical signals to attract bacteria floating in the water. The bacteria then enter through pores in the esker and settle there permanently. The weird part on the bacteria end is that research shows their evolution has actually caused them to lose a lot of their genes over time. It's like they've de-evolved. They have lost many of the genes needed for living independently in the ocean. Once upon a time, they would have been able to exist in the open ocean by themselves, but now they have lost all of the genes that give them the skills to do this. Just like the anglerfish depend almost entirely on these bacteria, the bacteria therefore rely equally desperately on the anglerfish. They have literally evolved to require the anglerfish to live. It's really fascinating to me how incredibly dependent each organism is on the other, seemingly to an almost destructive extent. I mean, the two could not exist without the other. It's like evolution has left no margin for error and completely assumed that the other species will always exist, which I think is one of the most interesting and intimate symbioses I've ever come across. For the final section in this episode, I want to take a quick look at bioluminescence in non-marine environments, because whilst the vast majority of bioluminescing species are marine and aquatic, there are land-dwelling ones too. Now, we know, hopefully quite well, how bioluminescence works after all that, so I'm not going to dwell on the reaction itself, but look more at the purpose of it in different organisms to sea creatures. Fireflies use a series of bioluminescent yellow and green flashes to communicate and attract mates, similar to the lanternfish. In other insects, like some millipedes and the railroad worm, which is the larvae of a specific beetle species, bioluminescence is a warning light to deter predators, similar to the dinoflagellate plankton. But it's not just animals who bioluminesce. Ghost mushrooms and honey fungus both glow at night, which is thought to be to attract insects, which will then crawl over or eat the fungi, picking up spores which it will then spread to other areas. Interestingly though, this isn't known to definitely be the case. Some research suggests that bioluminescence is just a coincidental byproduct of other reactions occurring in the fungi that help break down wood. I think this is a really striking contrast from the extreme dependence the anglerfish-bacteria symbiosis has on bioluminescence and the other marine glowing creatures that have highly evolved mechanisms. It's interesting how, for some species, it's a highly adapted feature of evolution that the organism absolutely depends on to survive, requiring all sorts of specially adapted cells and mechanisms, and yet for another organism, it may just be an accident that serves little to no purpose. Glowing fish, glowing fungi, and glowing insects are all amazing. But for me, I think one of the most fascinating things I've found about bioluminescence isn't the unusual glowing organisms alone, but the effect that it's had on my perception of light. That sounds a bit serious and profound, but what I mean is kind of what I was getting at when I introduced this episode. I think we tend to associate light with heat, flames, and electricity, things that are powerful and energetic. But the cold light of bioluminescence has, at least for me, introduced a new perspective. Whilst light can be the product of something wild and burning like a star, it can also be carefully controlled and produced by something as simple as a unicellular organism or a fish. I also think it's that element of control that specifically intrigues me, because even in some of the most powerful light sources like stars, they're not really in control of it, it's just happening. It's a process between chemicals, and energy is released as a result of these processes, emitting light and heat as a sort of byproduct of the reaction. And yet some tiny unicellular organisms or fish in the very, very deepest parts of the ocean can actually control it. I don't know, I just think that's really interesting, that these huge, powerful astronomical objects are the brightest things that we can think of, yet they can't actually control the light. It's the deep sea creatures who have this amazing ability to control and sort of switch their light on and off like a light switch, which is actually much more similar to some kind of high-tech man-made thing, but it's really just something that nature has picked up through evolution. I just think that's really fascinating. I think it really highlights just how bizarre the ocean is. We've only explored about 20% of the ocean. There's so much we don't know, but really some of the most amazing and peculiar processes are happening here. Well, that's all for today. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have enjoyed this episode. If you have, remember to leave a review or a rating, and I'm very glad to be back doing the podcast. Special acknowledgement for anyone who has been listening to the podcast since before the great A-level break, as I'm apparently now calling it. Thanks for your patience. I hope you're also looking forward to a summer of many more episodes to come, so stay tuned. Remember to check out the Instagram and new YouTube page. I'm thinking about expanding those a bit over the summer too. Maybe some short form content and stuff, so look out. Anyway, I'll catch you in the next episode, but until then, stay curious, and if you take nothing else from this episode, at least you now know how to get that enviable, gorgeous natural glow. Bye!